Okay, so here we go. So we're introducing Understanding Behaviour in Schools Toolkit, and this is the plan for the session. So we're going to keep really to time, aren't we? Because we all want to go back to see Richard again at 12 o'clock and some other videos and input. So this is the plan for our session today. Thank you very much for joining us, and lovely to see the range of people from lots of different schools and organisations. I'm going to introduce you to the toolkit, and I'm going to tell you about the key ideas and the research behind it. Give you a chance at various points to pause and reflect. But if you have any comments or questions, pop them on the chat as we go through, and Ashley will be on there keeping an eye on them for me. Then we're going to look at some of the practical tools that schools and organisations can use that are in the toolkit. And we are going to send you away having a think about your next steps and your planning in terms of using this toolkit for your school or organisation. So let me just tell you a little bit of a history of the project and the toolkit. So it all started in summer 2019, many moons ago, in the old days, pre-COVID, when people could meet in person. So a group of us got together at Meadow House in Mansfield to talk about a working group in the area of relationship-based practice. So at the start, we were a group of Nottinghamshire County Council people from different education services. And we got together to think about the local and the national context in terms of relationship-based working. There were a couple of things happening locally in relation to school exclusions, the things that schools were asking for from services, the things that schools were telling us that they really valued from services and what they wanted more of. So we got together, we got some key ideas together, we did a literature review, we wrote a sort of a position paper, and we started by consulting with schools. So we went to various different governance meetings with the primary board, the secondary board, etc., various meetings linked with behaviour partnerships and different school representatives to get their consultation. And we published our position paper, which is the first bit I'm going to tell you about, the key ideas and the research, in January 2020. So we were all set in March 2020 to have a big launch. And as you all know, something else happened in March 2020, which completely sidelined all of our plans. So what we did was we started a schools working group, and we had representatives from various schools. We had a really good range of representatives from mainstream, special schools, primary, secondary, and alternative education providers. And in the toolkit, you can see the full list of people who were involved. And the full toolkit launched in autumn 2020 in the end. And it's over the next year or so that we're going to be sort of really bringing it to life, updating it, getting hopefully examples of schools in Nottinghamshire who are using this, and maybe even adding more tools to it as schools tell us what they're using. So, excuse me, the initial position paper was around proposing these three key ideas, which are the foundations of a relationship-based approach to inclusion in education settings. The first is that behaviour is a form of communication of an unmet need. And so in order to change behaviour, we must respond to the unmet need. And we must understand what that unmet need is if we really want to change the behaviour. The second key idea is that children's behaviour can't be fully understood in isolation without considering their individual influences. So many of you might be familiar with the iceberg model, and this idea that behaviour that we might see is the tip of the iceberg, but actually what's going on underneath the surface and all the other factors in the child's environment are key things, those individual influences that we need to understand in order to understand behaviour. In particular, behaviour that we find confusing, upsetting, or challenging. And the final key point, which is a firm statement from the research that we looked at, is that relationship-based and restorative approaches offer an evidence-based alternative to zero-tolerance behaviour management systems. And we did a bit of a review of that research, so I'll tell you a bit more about that later on. So let me tell you a little bit about the context. So there's the context in 2019, which was when lots of us didn't know what was to come. But this was the initial local and national context that the work initially came from. So in terms of the national figures, so the graph that you'll see in the, under the title of this slide is DFE figures from 2018. which showed that permanent and fixed term exclusions in schools had been rising steadily since 2012 in all settings. Similar to, linked to this, the Timpson review in May 2019 identified that exclusions from school were being linked in the research to negative life outcomes, and also particular groups were overrepresented in the exclusion rates nationally. At the same time, the work of schools was increasingly broadening out to what we would talk about as relationship-based or therapeutic working. So increasingly highly skilled staff in schools were doing a lot of emotional well-being, mental health, that type of support, and is having an impact on staff well-being. So increasingly there was a recognition to have support structures and advice and support for staff. So one of the key documents we were looking at was the Supporting Staff Wellbeing document here from the Anna Freud Centre. The other thing that happened in 2019, which was very timely, was the release of a new report from the Education Endowment Foundation, which you may or may not know is a think tank that produces evidence-based reports in different areas. And they produced a key report in 2019 looking at improving behaviour in schools and focusing on the research behind a relationship-based approach to understanding behaviour. So all of this sort of national and local context was the trigger for the project. And then, of course, we had a massive change in direction in all areas of life in March 2020 with the COVID context. However, it was really interesting, and I know this from working with so many of your schools over the last year, the importance of relationship-based working really became prominent in this time of crisis in schools. So we saw powerful statements from people like Bernardo's, who were recognising the importance of promoting children and adults' mental health in the recovery phase and calling for a clean slate in terms of putting children's mental health at the start of education. We had the Wellbeing for Education Return project in the autumn of this academic year, where schools were coming together, getting training and sharing ideas and resources about focusing on wellbeing for everybody in the school environment in the return to school. And then in the Educational Psychology Service, we were also involved in writing this national handbook with the Association of Educational Psychologists, Recovery, Reintroduction and Renewal, based on 5 key principles of recovery, focusing on relationships. So really the importance of relationships was prominent in the COVID recovery. And let me know in the chat if you have any examples, if you recognised that in your school, what did you guys do to sort of focus on recovery? One of the key things we focused on, and Richard actually touched on it in his talk, the idea of post-traumatic growth. So the idea of growing and recovering from trauma is the work of Judith Herman, who really emphasised that relationships are the foundation for recovery to take place. So in terms of relationship-based working, we are talking, oh, muted myself, that was a good idea, wasn't it? We are talking about the breakdown of relationships in schools. Things don't go right for children, their learning might be disrupted. Relationships is the context for any type of recovery, repairing of relationships, re-engagement with learning, transition to new contexts. And that is the foundation of the toolkit. So hopefully that gives you a bit of context. And I just want to draw your attention then to the 2 key references. So on my left, I think it's probably your left as well, it's the Improving Behaviour in Schools Guidance Report from the Education Endowment Foundation, which was in 2019, which focused in particular on some key recommendations for schools. So I definitely recommend you have a look at it. It's referenced in our toolkit as well. And they really were focusing on the importance of relationships and the importance of understanding individual influences for children. And the EEF is one of the first reports that really challenged the limitations of zero tolerance behaviourist approaches in schools and highlighted the great work that was happening all around the country in the use of relationship-based practice. We also drew heavily on the other document from Brighton and Hove City Council, which is about developing an attachment-aware behaviour regulation policy. And any of you who have done the attachment-aware schools or the now called Building Relational Schools training will recognize this document, and you'll know that within this document there's lots of key practical tools for schools. So we've drawn on that as well, and all of this has led us to develop our toolkit. And the great thing about the toolkit is that it has been developed, and lots of information has been added in by schools in Nottingham, schools and educational settings in Nottinghamshire, which I think is great. Okay, so let me take you through the key research and key ideas that are in the toolkit, and then we'll look at some of the tools. So as we go through, please feel free to ask any questions or make comments on the chat. Ashley can pick them up. So the core essence of a relationship-based approach says these key things. So a relationship-based approach is not a thing that we do on Tuesday afternoons at 2 o'clock. Relationship-based approach should underpin all support strategies in our educational settings and in schools, and lots of, just some of the schools I know here, I know that lots of this practice happens really well in Nottinghamshire. But schools who do this really well have relationships as a foundation for all of their policies and practice across the school. The approach is a different paradigm to a behaviourist approach. And while behaviourist strategies, when I say behaviourist, what I mean is rewards and consequences. So quite traditional psychology of learning and behaviour change. Work in some situations alone, they are often not effective, particularly in situations where there is a lot of complexity for the child's development. The risk when we focus just on behaviourist approaches is that punishments might teach nothing new and might increase anxiety and decrease self-esteem and trust. So behaviourist approaches sometimes are effective in changing behaviour in the short term, but unless there is a learning opportunity for the individual, the behaviour doesn't change longer term. There's often a misconception that relationship-based approaches mean there's no consequences, let children do whatever they like. That's not correct. And actually, children need limit setting and meaningful consequences to feel safe, to feel like they can understand the world, and to learn how to navigate into the adult world. So relationship-based approaches are all about learning how to understand limits that trusted adults set for you, learning to accept meaningful consequences which teach you cause and effect, and significantly, learning to repair safe relationships, learning that relationships can rupture and repair. There can be difficulties, there can be issues, there can be bumpy times, and we can repair relationships. So if you want a sort of a summary of everything that's in the toolkit and a description of what relationship-based approaches involve, this is the slide for you. Okay. So there's lots of evidence, and depending on your role, you'll be more or less interested in different things. So what I'll just do is give you a flavour of the key headlines from the research. If you want to know more, you can have a look and read in the toolkit. So the first thing that the EEF strongly said in 2019, which I've already touched on, is that there's limited research evidence for the effectiveness of zero tolerance behaviour management systems alone in schools. On their own, they don't provide learning opportunities. We touched on the DFA guidance about exclusions increasing. And unfortunately, there's evidence that exclusions have been linked to psychological distress, both as a cause and as a result for children and young people, to some specific negative light outcomes, such as incarceration. That comes from the Timpson review. And also, and this I guess is particularly relevant for those of us who work in support services, that particular groups of children are significantly more likely to be excluded from school. So those groups include children with special educational needs, children from Black Caribbean and mixed white and Black Caribbean groups, and significantly for today's conference, children in care. So we know that we need to listen to this research and to these guidance reports, particularly in our work for children in care. And we need to find out, what does the research tell us about things that we can do differently, or things that we already do well that we need to do more of in our schools. So guided and sort of inspired by this research evidence, we started to explore some of the key psychology in this area and got it into our toolkit. So there's some really powerful quotes from different psychologists and authors who've worked in this area that really sort of made us think We have used them a lot in the psychology service to develop our thinking about relationship-based practice. And those of you who have joined workshops and training sessions with us will recognize some of these key ideas that we talk about a lot. So the first quote comes from Dan Siegel, who is a child psychologist, an American child psychologist. And he reminds us, and I have to say for myself, when I first started learning about relationship-based practice and restorative discipline, this is something that really made me think, this quote. So he reminds us of the definition of the word discipline. And he reminds us that to discipline really means to teach, not to punish. And we must remember that a disciple is a student, not a recipient of behavioral consequences. So when we think and talk about discipline, it's all about creating teaching opportunities. And in our, when we look at restorative resources, so a restorative researcher called Belinda Hopkins has done a lot of work about the use of restorative practice in schools. And this slide is a really powerful tool for thinking. So this is not to make anyone feel uncomfortable, not to shame anybody, because certainly in my experience as a teacher, I have made these assumptions. This is to make us stop and think. So I'm going to share this slide and I'm going to just ask for your reactions in the chat. So have you ever made these assumptions? So when you see an academic error, for example, a child spelled a word wrong, we might assume that errors are accidental. They're inevitable. Everybody makes mistakes. It's how you learn. They signal a need for teaching. So we might need a little bit of extra spelling help. And students with learning difficulties need modified teaching. So for example, if that child has difficulties with literacy, they might need catch up. They might need extra help. When they get to college and university, they might need a laptop or a scribe. Have you ever made these assumptions when a child makes a behavior error? Okay, so they might say a crossword to their friend, or they might interrupt the teacher when the teacher is speaking. Have you ever made the assumption that behavior errors are deliberate? They did that on purpose. They should not happen. It's not acceptable. The errors should be punished. And students with behavioral difficulties should be punished rather than needing modified teaching. What are people's responses? And if you've seen this before, what did you think the first time you saw it? And how has your thinking changed? So I'll just have a look on the chat while people are sharing their responses about these assumptions. What kind of comments are people sharing, Ashley?
Very thought-provoking.
Oh, that's great. That's from Craig. In one of the schools I work with, they've got this up on the notice board in the staff room.
So Craig's added that he never thought about behaviour being deliberate/accidental.
So some of you might notice or might see that you haven't made these assumptions, which is great too. Absolutely. What about yourself, Ashley?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of mixed, I would say, especially as a teaching assistant not long ago. I used to work with a young girl and she had attachment issues, and a lot of the time she would lash out in class. But sort of our way of dealing with that was to not as such punish her, but to in fact give her time to self-regulate and then talk to her and sort of set the limits afterwards, because the punishment in that case just wasn't helpful.
Absolutely. So lots of reflections coming in. Those of you recognizing that you don't think like this, but there might be times when the system thinks like this. And I think that's a really interesting one. Recently on some training sessions, schools have been talking to us about how, you know, you as a practitioner don't think like this, but sometimes some of the systems in school are based on some of these assumptions. People are saying this has really made you think. It's powerful. It's great. And I guess that's the purpose, really, just to always question our practice. And even if you if you think, oh, I would never think like that, looking for opportunities to challenge times when you might see this assumption made. Absolutely. And it's interesting, some of you talking about parents and also other children. So Alexa, you're mentioning that, who are looking for punishment, aren't they? You know, so difficult for you guys in schools to navigate that if parents are saying, you know, there needs to be a consequence. Definitely lots of challenges. And so what was really interesting in the working party was when we first talked to schools, they said, we really buy into this, but it's really hard to put it into practice. So this is when we generated the toolkit, which was about schools who were doing this well, schools who were having a go, schools who were wanting to do something differently, coming together and starting to develop tools. So hopefully from today, from this session, and anyone who's watching this at a later date, it might be an idea of some resources you could use to get started. So another person I want to quote is Kate Cairns, who is a therapeutic foster carer, and she has fostered many foster children in care over the years, and she's got some great training and resources, and some of you might have attended her training in partnership with our virtual school a couple of years ago. So she has said loads of fantastic things, but a key quote from Kate is that the behaviour tells the story. And our job in using relationship-based approaches is to get to know the child, to understand their story, to understand their individual influences. And the way we do that is through our relationship with the child. Okay, so a couple more reflections before we move on. And that's interesting, Annie, understanding behaviour as not a behaviour choice, but linked to need. And I guess for me, a helpful way of opening up conversation, if someone says to me the child's choosing to do this behavior, is always to ask why. Okay, so why are they choosing to do the behavior, you know? So if a child is swearing and acting out against their trusted adult, why is that child doing that? What is the unmet need that the behavior is communicating? And how can we build a relationship to understand their individual influences? So a lovely example there, Annie, about how for this child, the unmet need is their sensory needs, and actually understanding the individual influences of that child's ASD can help you understand how to respond. Brilliant. Exactly. And loads of other factors that lots of you are talking about. You as an adult, your capacity, if you're tired, if you've got a lot of pressures, if you're under challenge, and I mean, the greatest challenge we've ever experienced in school contexts. Fantastic, Fiona, talking about the change of language. That is going to be brilliant in a moment when we come on to use of language. So we might come back to you for that one. So this is what's in the toolkit. I'm going to tell you, let me have a think. I'll tell you what, I'll tell you what's in the toolkit, because we seem to have a good conversation going on the chat, which is good. I'll tell you what's in the toolkit, and then I'll give you a chance to have a discussion between yourselves in small groups, rather than breaking into small groups after each bit. So what's in the toolkit? These are the appendices. So in the first appendix, there's practical tools and models that you can use, and you will recognize these as part of a lot of the virtual schools and educational psychology service training. And also within social care and children and family services, some of these models are also used. So I'll just talk you through some of those models, and if you want to know a bit more about them, you can link to the toolkit. Then there's a sample relationships and behaviour regulation policy. So schools got together and wrote a framework for any school in Nottinghamshire who would want to change their behaviour policy to a relationships and behaviour regulation policy. And there's examples from organisations and schools in Nots. There's a frequently asked questions appendix, which personally I have found really valuable, where schools got together and thought of the most frequently asked questions that would challenge their relationship-based practice. And a group of head teachers and senior leaders and teachers wrote answers to those. And there's an appendix on the use of language, so exactly like Fiona and Vanessa are talking about. So some ideas and some examples to help us think about the language we use around children and young people. So when we talk about the children, and the language we use with the child or young person, and how simple changes in our language, just like the example Fiona and Vanessa are giving, don't cost anything, don't take a lot of time, but can really make a difference. So how powerful in Richard's keynote speech when he was talking about the language that was used about him and his siblings when he was a child, the impact that still has on him today. So really powerful to think about our use of language. So, Appendix 5 then is some ideas about getting started. So some schools who've had a go at using relationship-based practice and sharing their lessons learned, which I think is really useful, you know, hearing from people who've had a go, what have they learned, particularly about the inclusion of pupil views. So including your students in these changes. And Appendix 6, which is quite useful, particularly if you're in a leadership position in your school. One of our subgroups, working groups of head teachers, one of whom has experience as an Ofsted inspector, talked about how the relationship-based approach can be demonstrated within the new Ofsted inspection framework, and so really useful. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through these various bits of the toolkit, and if you want, as we go through, you can download the toolkit from the chat, and you can have a look at the resources as we go through, but you're also welcome to just have a listen, and I'll pop it in the chat again, have a listen and just have a look afterwards. Okay, does anyone have any questions? If anything is not clear, just pop it on the chat and I'll take you through the toolkit. Okay, so these are the practical tools and models. And one of the key models within the toolkit is the responding in the moment model. Okay, so responding in the moment is something that Kate Taylor and I developed to try and pull together all the different models and areas of psychology in this area, because it can be a bit of a rabbit hole when you start looking into relationship-based practice. There's so many psychologists and educators and social workers and researchers who talk about this practice. So we tried to bring together this model. So it's based predominantly on the parenting in the moment model from Golding, but it also brings in restorative practice and emotion coaching and the idea of pace. So you might have heard bits and pieces of this in various places. It's a 7-step model, and it is a tool for one human being to support a conversation with another human being who is distressed. And the reason I'm saying human being is you could use this as an adult supporting a child who's distressed, but you could also use this as an adult supporting another adult. So for example, we have been using this model with the fostering service to support fostering social workers in their interactions with foster carers to help, you know, sometimes as a foster carer, it's a really hard job and it has an impact on your own well-being, to help conversations from adult to adult. Okay, so the steps involve 7 steps, but it's underpinned by the key idea that we connect before we correct. Okay, sounds simple, it's hard to do. So we connect with the other person before we correct and repair the behavior. But remember this sometimes misconception, the connection is not the only bit of relationship-based practice. It doesn't mean that there's no correction of behavior and repair. That bit of it is really, really important. So we connect and then we correct. And we also check in with ourselves. And actually, we do this in the first instance in this model. So if there's, let's say, for example, something kicking off in school, there's a young person who's really distressed. First thing we do is we check in with ourselves. Then we try to connect with the young person. Then we try to correct the behavior and repair the relationship. So we've split the model down into 3 steps. Check in with yourself. And that involves notice what's going on in the environment, notice what's happening for that child, notice their individual influences, notice what just happened before, notice what is happening in the bigger picture for the child, and notice the impact on you. And this is really important, emphasizing the importance of teamwork within schools and education settings. And I guess what's really important to emphasize is that this model, it shouldn't be on any one adult in the school environment. It shouldn't, so Ashley, your experience is working as a TA, and it shouldn't be only the responsibility on Ashley as the TA to help her student. It should involve all the adults in the school. And that really comes into play if for some reason on any given day, Ashley is not in a position to help that young person and might need support from the class teacher or one of the other TAs. Okay, so check in with yourself and check in about what's happening. Then connect with the child or the other adult. And this sometimes involves co-regulation. So sometimes, let me know if this is familiar to you, sometimes the child is not able to regulate themselves and they need co-regulation from the adult. So they might need the adult to guide them out of the room and go for a walk. They might be so distressed that they can't think straight. They can't think, oh yeah, I need to take myself out of this situation. So sometimes we need co-regulation. Show curiosity, and curiosity is the C part of PACE, which is an approach, an attachment informed approach for supporting children and young people. And this is about asking questions, wondering, and starting to try to label and name feelings. So in that curiosity phase, we might have things like, oh, I wonder if you're feeling a bit cross because you've had your phone taken off you and you really want to text your friend. And through all of this, steps 3, 4, and 5, we're connecting with the child. We're connecting with the young person. We might be using humor and having a bit of banter. We might be connecting with the child on a personal level. And when we connect, we remind the child that we are someone that they can trust. We are someone who has their best interests at heart, someone who's interested in them. And when we have that connection, then we can move on to correct and repair the behavior. And this model, the research behind this model tells us that if the child has connected with us and remembers that we're a trusted person who's trying to keep them safe, they're more likely to engage with conversations with us about limit setting, consequences, and repairing behavior. They're also more likely to understand that the consequences are a direct result of their behavior. If we sometimes jump past the notice the impact on us, we jump past the connection and we jump straight in with behavioral consequences, we run the risk that the child is distressed and doesn't understand that the consequence is linked to their behavior, and also doesn't understand that the adults around them are trying to keep them safe. That's why they're telling them, no, you can't run along the top of that wall, or no, you can't go on that website or on that app. So the whole process is a tool that adults can use to connect with children, remind the children that they're there to keep them safe. And this model has been used really well in fostering and social care work, and it is just starting to be implemented in schools. And actually Kim Golding has just published a book about the use of this model in schools, which is really timely. So I just got it in the post myself last week. Okay, so a key part of this, and I recognise some of you on our attendance list today have attended the emotion coaching training recently. So a key part of the model is also the use of emotion coaching. So I'm going to play a brief video. And I think, oh, I forgot I had a video. So what I need to do is I need to stop sharing and I need to share the sound. So I'll just pause. This is a little bit of me stalling now while I get my screen right, to ask you guys about your reflections on the responding in the moment model. Has anyone seen it before? Have you used it? What do you think about it?
Or frustrated sometimes, but Charlie is still learning how to manage these big feelings. Dan Siegel suggests that the brain is like a house, with an upstairs and downstairs. The upstairs brain is more complex and is where we learn, process language, and develop problem-solving and decision-making skills. With experience, problem-solving skills are refined, but the upstairs brain isn't fully formed until our mid-20s. The downstairs brain is responsible for breathing and impulsive reactions to strong emotions, like the fight, flight, or freeze response. Sometimes, when Charlie experiences very big emotions, she stays in the downstairs brain. On these occasions, she might act on the impulses she has, without thinking through the consequences. Before Charlie can understand and process these emotions, she needs support from a trusted adult, such as a parent, carer, or teacher. Once Charlie feels safe and calm, she can then be supported to move to the upstairs brain. Emotion coaching supports Charlie to be able to move from the downstairs brain to the upstairs brain through a process of co-regulation. Co-regulation is when a trusted adult is able to make a connection with Charlie and support her to feel safe, and this can help her to learn to manage these big feelings. Emotion coaching strengthens relationships through increased understanding and empathy. It is essential that the adult connects with the child's emotions rather than judging the child's reasons for feeling this way. This is achieved by the adult connecting with the child before correcting the behaviour. Emotion coaching has 5 key steps. 1. Notice the child's behaviour and tune in to the emotion beneath. 2. Connect with the child and recognise emotional times as opportunities for intimacy and teaching. 3. Listen empathetically and validate the child's feelings. 4. Help the child to verbally label emotions. 5. Set limits on the child's behaviour whilst helping the child to problem solve. There are a number of potential benefits to using emotion coaching. These include supporting children to regulate their emotions, promoting positive relationships between adults and children, increasing academic attainment, and helping adults to feel empowered to manage children's behaviour. If you think you could...
Okay, so a quick introduction to emotion coaching. You'll recognise the key ideas behind the responding in the moment model there, and services like ourselves in the educational psychology service can deliver training in emotion coaching, and lots of you have attended that. And there's also lots of resources online if you look up Emotion Coaching UK, if you want to have a look. Okay, so let me show you and talk you through a couple more of the resources, because I'm mindful of the time and we want to get through everything. So in terms of restorative approaches, some schools have talked to us about using the social discipline window. So understanding, and this is a key part of emotion coaching as well, understanding the need to do things with children. So this is particularly linking to the idea of the need for consequences and limit setting. So on the red axis, you'll see the level of challenge, and on the blue axis, you'll see the level of support. Okay, so if we have high challenge and low support, this would be sort of a punitive or authoritarian approach where we would do things to people. And equally, if we have low challenge and low support, this would be sort of neglectful, where we don't really care and we're also not really providing any support. If we are providing high support but low challenge, this would be about doing things for people and sometimes being permissive. And what we aim for with restorative approaches and within emotion coaching is to provide high support and high challenge. So this is where we do things with people. We push children to engage with natural consequences, but we also provide a high level of support through our relationships. And it's hard work, some of the comments that you guys have been making in the chat, definitely. And it also recognizes that sometimes if we slip into the other modes, that's okay, we're all human. So it's not, using a relationship-based approach is not about being perfect every minute of the day, because just like the model says, we are human, we have our own things going on. Sometimes we need to check in with ourselves before and after an incident and say, well, that didn't really go very well. How could I do it better next time? Or equally, that was really good today. I really connected with that young person. There's some resources as well, practical tools from L30 Relational Systems, which comes from the author Mark Finnis, about practical ways to build relationships in schools and organisations. So that's a really good resource to look at, some practical tips. So the final practical tool that's in the toolkit is, it's a bit like a directory of resources. So you've got the 6 recommendations from the Improving Behaviour EEF report. and then some hyperlinks to key resources if you want to know a bit more. So there's a lot of information in that tool, and it might be something you look at when you come to do your school improvement plans, when you look at continuing professional development, CPD for your staff. So lots of you, so for example, Fiona talking about the challenges of rolling this approach out across the whole school, and definitely that is a real challenge that the school working group talked about. So one of the things they said is that it's great to have these practical tools to support work with young people, but we also need support to change our school systems to roll this out at a whole school level. So the next couple of tools are to help you do that. So as we go through these tools, let me know if you have seen them or anything similar before, or if they're new to you, let me know what you think. Does it sound useful? So the first is a sample relationships and behaviour regulation policy. So it's a framework and you can download it and access that. You can edit it with your own school logo, your own school values, etc. And there's also some examples from schools who were involved in the working group who gave us permission to share some of their behaviour, relationships and behaviour regulation policies. So there's an example from Real Education, the alternative provision and independent school that we worked closely with, and also from one of our not schools, Ravenshead C of E Primary. So the framework is there. So if you are rewriting your behaviour regulation policy, it's a framework that you can use, and lots of schools have already looked at this as part of the Building Relational Schools project. So that is there as a tool. The FAQs resource is also there. So this is particularly useful if you have particular questions or challenges from groups in your school. So if you have questions from parents, if you have questions as a leadership team, as a class teacher, really useful to have a look at these FAQs. So the questions and answers have been written by school and education staff. So one of the biggest FAQs that staff told us they were asked, and also they asked themselves when they were starting out using relationship-based approaches, is how will students know where the line is for unacceptable behaviour? And how will a child learn if there are no consequences? So this again is this misconception that restorative approaches mean no consequences. And so it's really useful if we get asked this question to really highlight the fact that setting limits on behaviour and negotiating expectations within the context of a relationship is a core element of the approach. And really to start exploring the idea of natural consequences. And in the FAQs resource, there's lots of examples that school staff have shared of natural consequences they have used. So for example, writing letters of apology to someone that you have harmed or upset, repairing damage to property, and completing missed work from a lesson during detention. So the child would understand that they are doing the maths work because they didn't do it in the maths lesson, for example. So really good, I think, to have some practical examples from schools of natural consequences. And I guess, again, the child is more likely to understand and engage with the consequence and understand that it's not a punishment that's happening to them because they're a bad person. It's a consequence of their behaviour. And they can choose to do different things next time, which will lead to different consequences. And all the time, they are able to have these thinking through thought experiments, which can be really hard, can't they? You know, understanding that something negative has happened as a result of your behaviour is a potential trigger for shame and upset, isn't it? So it's really important that you have a trusted adult with you, whether it's your TA, your class teacher, your head teacher, who's there saying our relationship is here all the time, and we can have these difficult conversations in the context of that relationship. So really useful, lots of other FAQs there if you want to have a look. And I guess what's really useful from the restorative approaches training, and I just wanted to pick this bit out and share with you, is a sort of a formula for generating natural consequences. So changing the language from punishment to consequences and making sure that we're designing consequences that are natural and are specifically designed to repair any damage to relationships or property. So a key formula, which I find really useful in my work with schools, is that there should be a relational element and there should be an educative element. So there should be the relationship, but also the child needs an opportunity to learn something. So for example, the second one there, instead of going out at break, I want you to stay with me, there's the relationship, and we will put all the books back on the shelves that you tipped on the floor. there's the repair, and also the learning. If you knock all the books off the shelf, someone's got to put them back. You've done it, you'll put them back, but I'll be with you. So it's quite a helpful formula there. Okay. There's a resource then about the use of language. There's loads here. We could spend a whole session on this, so I'm just throwing information at you. And I think it was Fiona and Vanessa earlier. We've drawn on the work of Beacon House, which is a therapeutic services and trauma team. Definitely have a look at their website if you work with children in care. They've got loads of great resources and videos. And they've got some great resources about shifting the language from attention seeking to attachment seeking, from aggressive to frightened. So there's some practical tools in there for you to have a think. There's also lessons learned. So some top tips from schools who've had a go. In particular, some schools and organisations like our tech team, Tackling Emerging Threats to Children, who have done some projects in schools about involving children in the development of relationship-based approaches. And schools talked about bringing in their school council, having relationship-based ambassadors in the student population, loads of really good practical tips. So something really important to think about for schools is the inspection framework that schools are inspected against. And what was really powerful, I was actually in this subgroup, and it was a really powerful piece of work. So what you'll find in this toolkit is the new inspection framework, all the different sections, and then examples for each section on how a school who uses relationship-based approaches can evidence that within the Ofsted inspection framework. And that was supported by one of our head teachers who has experience working with Ofsted. And so I think that will be really useful if you're in a leadership position in your school, if you want to have a look at that. Lots of practical examples. Okay, time for reflection. Right. What we're going to do is we're going to give you a chance to just have 5 minutes in small groups reflecting on this. I know we're pushing for time, but we'll stick to our time. So let me just invite you to join a breakout room, and just going to give you 5 minutes to reflect with other people in the session. What do you think of the toolkit? If you've come across it before, have you been having a go? If it's new to you, which bits of it are you most interested in? Okay, so you get an invitation to a breakout room. You've got 5 minutes to check in with others. I appreciate it's not a lot of time. And I'll call you back in here, just a final checkout before we go back to the main conference room. Okay, so you should get an invitation to a breakout room. Ashley, you're welcome to join the room if you want. And
yes, I will do.
Others, and I'll stay in here. Okay. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Sorry you didn't get too long to talk, but just wanted you to have a chance to check in. I've got 1 minute left. I'm going to share with you some key ideas around the importance of self-care for school staff, in particular in working in a relationship-based approach. So the key idea that we need to look after ourselves. We can't pour from an empty cup. So the importance of supporting school well-being. And some key resources that we've been sharing as part of the Wellbeing Education Return for adults. So some specifically for education adults, so adults working in education, for example, education support, and also some adult mental health services such as the Samaritans that Richard touched on in his talk. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with this quote from Dr. Karen Treisman, who has some great resources around trauma-informed organisations and relationship-based practice. She has one illustration that says every moment and interaction is an intervention. And I'm going to challenge you today even further to say that every moment and interaction can be an intervention. So we can be active in those moments with children and young people to make them an intervention and to make a lasting difference in our relationship-based approach. So thank you so much for your time. If anybody wants to just check out on the chat, if you want to drop us a comment or a word on any questions, do that, and in 1 minute the session will close. So what we need you to do is to go back to your program and click on the final session, which will be the hearing the voices of the young people and a final comment from Richard. Okay, so yes, good question. You will get the slides sent to you by email. So from the same email address that sent you the meeting invitation. Okay, so glad everybody found it useful, and we'll see you